Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Amidst the cacophony of social and cultural noise that's all around us, we have too often neglected the role of the arts in shaping who we are and how we might be better, or at least different. Like almost everything else, we tend to commodify the arts, everything from streaming revenue to box office grosses to the price of paintings at auction. I would argue that what we don't do enough of is look deep into the artists themselves. Artists who, by the very nature of their work, must keep their emotions closer to the surface. And in so doing, we can see how their work reflects the best and the worst aspects of our culture. Mike Nichols was such an artist. In a multi-decade spanning career, the films and plays he directed have in some ways impacted us all. In the early comedy of Nichols and May, to the social insight of films like The Graduate, Silkwood, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Catch-22, to his plays that reflected who we were in the human comedy. He not only understood his art and craft, but valued other artists, specifically actors and writers, as creative tools to help him help us see the world. My guest, Mark Harris, gives us all of this in his new biography of Mike Nichols. Mark Harris is one of our premier chroniclers of the art of film. He's the author of Pictures at a Revolution and Five Came Back, and is currently a writer for New York Magazine, where he often covers the intersection of culture and politics. It is my pleasure to welcome Mark Harris back to this program to talk about his new book, Mike Nichols, A Life. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. When we look at the career and the work of Mike Nichols, even though so much of it feels contemporary, a lot of it feels almost anachronistic, as if Nichols truly was a director and an artist of another time. Talk about that.
Well, in some ways, that's certainly true. I mean, his career was so long that when we talk about Mike Nichols, the director, we're talking about work that first started in 1963 with Barefoot in the Park on Broadway, and a film career that first began in 1966 with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So, and yet at the other end, his last movie was Charlie Wilson's War. One of his last big popular successes on stage was Spamalot. So it's really a sort of extraordinary span of work. He's worked with everyone from Elizabeth Taylor to Natalie Portman, and from George C. Scott and Richard Burton to Jude Law and Philip Seymour Hoffman. So it's a 20th century life and a 21st century life.
I guess what's different is that he never was a writer. He never really subscribed to being the auteur. He did it in his own and very different way.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, when we think of the directors that we talk the most about now, with a few exceptions, they write their own movies. I mean, there are exceptions and major ones, but a lot of people are writer-directors now. That was not something that Mike Nichols was ever interested in. And one thing that really marks his career from the beginning is not just that he's interested in working with actors, but that he's interested in working with writers, whether it's playwrights like Neil Simon and David Rabe and Tom Stoppard, or screenwriters like Nora Ephron. I mean, he didn't view screenwriters as a necessary evil or an inconvenience. He viewed them as separate artists and viewed his own job in a way as serving their vision. He once said that the way he defined style was to take whatever work had been done by a writer and present it, whether on stage or on film, in a way that made it believable. And that's really something that sets him far apart from other directors.
Was he serving their vision, or was part of his genius the way he could get both actors and writers to serve his vision of the work?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, Mike was not subservient in any way, and not modest, certainly. But he was also smart enough not to try to bully anyone into seeing a project his way. I mean, he knew what he wanted, and that's really true from the very beginning, even with something like Barefoot in the Park in 1963, or Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf on film in 1966, he said even then that he almost surprised himself by having a very sure sense of what it was supposed to be, but how to get there. He also understood was a process of collaboration. That he had his hand on the wheel, but he also knew that to get to his destination, he had to figure out a way to talk to each actor in the most helpful possible way, to collaborate with cinematographers and editors, which was a very important relationship for him, and to make sure that the the writer was feeling good about what was done and was also doing his best work. I mean, Mike did not believe that every word of a script was sacred, but he did believe that the person who was best equipped to the script was the writer himself or herself, not him.
Given how collaborative he was, given all the personalities that he had to deal with, talk about the ways in which that impacted him, both in terms of his public and private persona, that there was so much of himself that was invested really in the art of others.
I think Mike was nourished by other people. He had these. He had a sort of tough set of personal circumstances at the beginning of his life. He was an immigrant. He spoke no English. Arrived in New York at 7. Was bald because of a reaction to a vaccine, and experienced all of the humiliation and bullying that went with not looking or sounding like other kids. So he once said that it took him 3 hours to become Mike Nichols every day. He told the actor George Siegel that. And Mike said that effort at self-presentation could exhaust him so much that sometimes he just really needed to sleep and to kind of not be a person, not be a public person for several hours at a time. But I don't think that collaborating with other people ever exhausted him. I think it was the opposite. I think that when he was sitting in a room working with actors or working with a writer or working with a whole creative team on a play or a movie, he was energized by it. I didn't really find anything in my research to suggest that he ever had the experience, even on a difficult production, of saying, "Oh, I just can't stand any of these people anymore. I don't want anything to do with them." That's not the way he was wired. That's not the way he thought.
Talk about that exercise of becoming the public persona. It's very, I mean, partly because of the Broadway connection, it's very Bob Fosse-esque in a way, that sense of, every day is showtime.
Uh, I think so. I've read a couple of things that say in an almost accusing fashion, well, he was one person publicly and put on this incredibly composed human face, but privately he was another person. And first of all, who isn't? Like, we all do that. We all have a sort of game face that we put on for the world, and we're someone a little different when we're in the privacy of our own kitchens or living rooms. And second, the effort to compose yourself, the effort to have to make yourself into somebody who you think is suitable for public consumption, which on Mike's part was a considerable effort every day when he was young, does not mean that you're a phony or a poser. It means that you face special challenges in figuring out what you need to do to survive. And I think for Mike, particularly early in his life, it really did feel like a matter of survival to master this version of himself that he could present to the outside world that was everything he didn't feel like he was on the inside, composed, polished, witty, urbane, suave, and then he really, over the years, became that. I mean, the outside and the inside became a lot more in sync than they had been when he was very young.
Is that a clear arc in his life that those two things came together as he grew as both a person and an artist over the years?
I think it's a gradual process and not necessarily a purely linear one. I think, as for a lot of us who try to make progress on certain aspects of our own lives, two steps forward, one step back. It's making the same mistake over and over and over again, but eventually recognizing the mistake and realizing it, and then maybe not making it anymore. So I think that Mike's evolution into the man he became was really incremental, and late in his life he talked very frankly and openly about some of the struggles he had, not only with things like depression, but with issues like a mean streak or a cold streak. Mike, when he was under a lot of pressure, could be nasty, for instance, to someone on a film crew or a minor actor, and he really, really disliked that about himself, and it was something he worked very hard, and I think ultimately successfully, to overcome. It was something he tried to understand about himself as the decades went on, and I think that's a really admirable journey for anyone to look honestly at what you don't like about yourself and what behavior kind of mortifies you, and to really strive to understand it so that you can change it.
Did he like being a public person, a celebrity of sorts?
I think he did. I don't think that Mike was necessarily hungry for fame or for attention, but I think he really enjoyed recognition in both senses of that word. I think he liked being recognized on the street, and he liked being recognized for his work. Being honored for his work. I don't think that he had a particular appetite to be famous, except because it made getting the things that fame could bring you much more accessible. Whether it was access to the other people he wanted to know or professional opportunities. But I don't think he was one sort of race the nearest camera or microphone and be particularly hungry for an opportunity to put himself forward publicly. I mean, we should remember that he's someone who really said repeatedly that he only found the destiny of his professional life when he stopped being a performer, when he stopped being on stage, and decided to work behind the scenes instead.
And did he like Hollywood? I mean, it's interesting that he did a movie once. I guess it was one of the live shows, so that he could get more time on the Warner's corporate jet.
Right. I mean, it's. I think he had a love-hate relationship with Hollywood. I mean, he once said that he found it a kind of dangerous place because he said that living in a place where the guy who does your valet parking knows exactly what your first weekend grosses were was very stressful, and that he recognized in himself the tendency when he spent a lot of time in Los Angeles to become kind of hostage to that. To those markers of status, that he certainly was status conscious enough so that he knew his own vulnerabilities would that his ego, that what he called the baby side of him would really come to the surface if he spent too much time in Los Angeles. So he did work there occasionally, and some of his most famous movies were shot on studio back lots. But I think when possible, he preferred to work elsewhere, particularly in New York.
Talk a little bit about the diversity of his work, because this is another area where, in some ways, arguably, it's different from some contemporary directors. I mean, there's a wide range of the kind of work that he did. It didn't fit into any particular genre necessarily. It didn't have any kind of specific creative arc or career arc that he wanted to build. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, and part of that, of course, is a function of the fact that he worked with different writers rather than write his own movies. But another part of it is about, in a way, the fact that Mike, although he directed until, even just within the last 10 years, just before he died, was a kind of classical movie director in that, all those guys like George Stevens and William Wyler and Howard Hawks, who worked for studios, would work in different genres all the time. I mean, Howard Hawks made a musical, he made westerns, he made detective films, and Mike was a little bit the same way. He once said that if you had to categorize his work, you could say that it often centered on a man and a woman around a bed, and there is that common thread through a lot of his work. But when you look at his body of work, which is only 18 or 20 movies, it's not huge the way some people's sort of list of films are. There are service comedies like Biloxi Blues. There are romantic comedies like Working Girl. There are very intense chamber dramas like Closer and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. He made a couple of big films about war, Catch-22, and in a way Charlie Wilson's War. So, what you see is other than obviously a bent for comedy, and a real interest in the kind of complicated sexual dynamics of the modern world, what you see is just Mike's appetite to work with different writers in different styles or with different performers manifest in his body of work. He even made a horror movie with Wolf. He's one of the few sort of major directors to have just decided to dabble in that and see what it was like.
In all his body of work and all the time that you spent understanding him and talking to all these people in his life, which of the films really most represent who he was?
He said a really interesting thing at one point, and he was talking about Silkwood, which is not a movie that I necessarily would have said represented who Mike was. But what he said was, it's always about you. It's always about who you are. And even if you don't realize it when you choose the project, you're choosing a project because it represents something in your own life that you want expressed on film, or something about the moment that you're living in that you want expressed. And it always strikes me that, it's an amazing thing that Karen Silkwood, the character played by Meryl Streep, and Benjamin Braddock, the character played by Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, were two characters that were united by the fact that Mike felt a particular kind of identification with them and didn't realize it until well after he had made the movie. And Mike was certainly interested enough in human psychology so that it fascinated him and even kind of delighted him that he didn't know it at the time. He laughed at the fact that he didn't realized that he identified with the main character in The Graduate until years later, and he was amused by it with Silkwood too.
Did he have a sense of wanting to create or caring about creating not just films that would be successful and memorable, but really enduring characters?
I don't think so, because I don't think he felt that. I mean, Mike was very clear about what a director did and did not do, and I don't think that he felt that character creation was his job. He often said that nobody knows on a movie set or in a rehearsal room for a play, nobody knows what a character should say better than the writer does. And that doesn't mean they've always figured it out, but it means that they should almost always be given the chance to try to figure it out. So I don't think that he saw that creating characters was his job. I think he felt that creating the overall story, making it real, that was his job. I mean, he used to say that the two questions a director has to answer are, what is this really like? No matter how outlandish the situation that's being represented in the movie that you're making, what is it really like, and what happens next? He did feel that it was a director's job to keep his eye on the story in terms of, like, is it moving forward? Is the audience being successfully put in a situation in a way that they can connect to, in a way that that can make them say, yes, this is what it's like, whether it's, to come home from college and feel alienated from your parents and your friends and to drift into an affair, or I guess to work in a publishing house and realize that what you really want to do is turn into a werewolf. If you can find what it's really like and then tell the story in a way that makes the audience really curious about what's going to happen next, how it's all going to turn out, then he felt that as a director, you had done your job.
Who were the filmmakers and the films that he admired?
He really admired George Stevens. He talked about him a lot, particularly the movie A Place in the Sun, which is, the adaptation of Dreiser's American Tragedy that came out in 1950 and starred Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor and Shelley Winters. That was a movie that not only did Mike see, by his own estimation, between 100 and 150 times, but when people would come to him and say, I want to direct a movie, theater directors, for instance, who wanted to direct their first movie, he would say to them, okay, the first thing you do is go watch A Place in the Sun 25 times, and then we'll talk, and then go watch it 25 more times. It was really kind of a sacred text to him. And in theater, in particular, Elia Kazan, the director who first put A Streetcar Named Desire on stage, was incredibly important to him in terms of helping him understand what a director's role could be and what a director could do to make the events of a play believable. So Stevens and Kazan, I think, among many directors he admired, certainly William Wyler was on that list. And again, it's understandable that he gravitated toward those directors. They didn't write. They worked in a lot of different genres. They were infinitely adaptable, and they were all known for eliciting fantastic performances from their actors. So he definitely picked the right role models for the career that he ended up having.
How did he view contemporary auteur directors? How did he see them?
I don't think Mike had a lot of patience with critical theorizing about the auteur theory, but I think there were a lot of different directors that he admired, including directors that we would call auteurs. I mean, one thing that I think really distinguished Mike throughout his life, but especially later in his life, was he was never threatened by talent. He didn't view himself as being competitive with other directors. Even, in the middle of his career, in the 1970s, when he hit this lull, he would look at the work of a director like Robert Altman, who was really doing great work at the time, and not say, oh, I'm better than he is, why is he getting all this attention? But he would say to himself, why can't I do what he's doing? And then late in his career, when he really had nothing else to prove, he was very enthusiastic about younger directors, whether it was a director like Steven Soderbergh, or with whom he became very good friends, or Bennett Miller, who made Moneyball and Foxcatcher. When a young director's work excited him, he would reach out and take them to lunch and talk about it. He because he knew that they would be too shy to call him. So he made the effort in a way that a lot of established directors late in their careers do not do.
And talk a little bit about how he saw roles for women, because in many ways, whether it was Silkwood or Heartburn, he was really ahead of his time in that regard.
Absolutely. I mean, and sometimes to his detriment critically. I mean, a movie like Heartburn was dismissed by most male critics as a woman's picture, and that term was used really disparagingly, as if to say, why would a director of Mike Nichols' caliber be trifling with something so inconsequential? But Mike always saw women as worthy collaborators and as equal. I think you would have to go back to his partnership with Elaine May to understand the origins of that. I mean, it's a very unique thing for someone of Mike's age to have started his professional career with a woman as not only an equal partner, but in his eyes, I think the more creatively talented of the two of them. He really thought that she propelled their work together, and I think maybe because that laid the groundwork for the rest of his career. He was always just very happy and energized around women, very comfortable working with them, very comfortable taking ideas from them, whether it was Meryl Streep or Emma Thompson or Nora Ephron or women behind the scenes. His costume designer, Ann Roth, over many, many years was very important to him and someone he really listened to. Anthea Silbert, another costume designer. I mean, he really paid attention to women without condescending to them at all.
And finally, Mark, how do you think, in terms of a body of work, how will Mike Nichols' career be remembered?
Well, it's so hard to know because, of course, half of his career, the theater half, is something that we can only recapture by talking to people about what those plays were like. Theater vanishes, movies stick around, but I think certainly the best of Mike Nichols' movies have already proven themselves to be films that we can watch over and over and over again, whether that's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf or The Graduate or Working Girl, or most recently a movie like Closer, which to my surprise turns out to have a kind of very avid cult following among people who are now in their 30s and grew up with that movie. So I think you ultimately get judged no matter who you are, the best half of your resume, and I think the best half of Nichols' resume has already proven that it's built to last.
Mark Harris, the book is Mike Nichols, A Life. Mark, I thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thanks again for letting me talk about Mike. It's a pleasure.